The chamber went silent the moment I stood up, not the polite silence of respect, the heavy silence of a room that did not expect what was coming. My name is Ethan Hale, and I was the last human ambassador to ever speak inside the Galactic Council. 3 seconds before I rose from my chair, the Speaker of the Council, a tall being named Vorn Kesh, had just finished announcing a new sanction against Earth. He said it the way someone reads a grocery list. Board. Certain. Final. Humanity, he said, would surrender its outer colony near the Vela system to the Threll Alliance, because the Threll had, in his words, a stronger historical claim to the region. The colony had 11,000 human civilians living on it. Families, children, farmers who had spent 20 years turning red dust into wheat fields. Vorn Kesh did not mention any of that. To him, it was a line item. I looked at Grace Whitfield, sitting beside me. She was our senior policy officer, the one who had spent 6 years trying to make the council listen to reason. She gave me a small nod. We had talked about this moment the night before, in a quiet hallway outside our quarters, neither of us raising our voices, both of us already knowing what had to happen. I stood up slowly. My chair made a soft sound against the floor, and somehow that tiny noise was louder than anything else in the room. Ambassador Hale, Vorn Kesh said, his 4 eyes turning toward me with the mild irritation of someone interrupted mid-sentence. Do you have an objection to file? No, I said. I have an announcement. A few of the delegates chuckled. The Drayan representative, a species that found human emotions endlessly amusing, leaned toward his neighbor and whispered something that made them both smile. I did not smile back. Effective immediately, I said, the human race is withdrawing from all diplomatic relations with the Galactic Council. All treaties are considered void. All trade agreements are considered closed. All embassies on Earth and its colonies will be vacated within 72 hours. We will no longer send representatives to this chamber, and we will no longer respond to any communication from any member species, unless that communication is a formal declaration of peace, offered without conditions. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Vorn Kesh laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. It was the laugh of someone who has heard a joke he did not expect from a species he considered simple. Ambassador Hale, humans do not have the authority to end diplomacy. Diplomacy is not something you can simply stop attending, like a dinner party you find dull. We're not ending diplomacy, I said. We're ending our participation in yours. The laughter faded, just slightly. You misunderstand your position, Vorn Kesh said, his tone sharpening. Earth exists within a framework of interstellar law that governs trade, travel, and territory. Without a seat at this table, your species will have no voice, no protection, and no standing among the stars. You will be alone. We've been alone for a long time, I said. We just didn't say it out loud until now. I turned to Grace. She stood, gathered the folder of documents in front of her, and did not look back at the council once. Behind us, 17 other members of the human delegation rose from their seats, one after another, in complete silence. No shouting, no dramatic exit, just people standing up and walking toward the door, the way you would leave a meeting that had already decided nothing useful would come from staying. I remember the sound of our footsteps on that polished floor. It was the only sound in the entire chamber. Just before I reached the door, I heard Vorn Kesh call out, more amused than concerned, "This is theater, Ambassador. You will be back within the week, asking for terms." I stopped at the doorway. I turned around one last time. "You've never once asked what humanity actually wanted," I said. "You only ever asked what we could give you. That's why this is happening. Not because we're angry, because we're finally free to stop pretending your table was ever fair." I walked out. The doors closed behind me with a heavy, final sound, like the closing of a book that would never be reopened. Outside the chamber, the halls of the council station were busy as always, filled with beings from 100 worlds moving between meetings, trade negotiations, and cultural exchanges that never seemed to include us in any meaningful way. Nobody out there yet knew what had just happened inside. For a few more minutes, the galaxy was still the same shape it had always been. Grace walked beside me, her jaw tight, her eyes forward. "You think they understood what we just did?" she asked quietly. "No," I said. "I don't think they'll understand until it starts to hurt." We reached the human shuttle bay, where the rest of our delegation was already boarding. I paused at the entrance and looked back down the long corridor toward the council chamber one final time. Somewhere behind those doors, 100 species were still debating fishing rights and mineral quotas as if nothing important had just happened. They had no idea that the quiet species from the small blue planet, the one they called Simple, the one they used as a convenient errand runner whenever a crisis needed solving and a reward never needed sharing, had just decided to stop showing up. I thought about my grandfather then, an old engineer who used to tell me that the most dangerous person in any room is the one everyone assumes has nothing left to say. The shuttle doors closed. Grace sat across from me, finally letting a slow breath out, the kind of breath you hold when you are not sure if what you just did was brave or reckless. "Do you think they'll come after us?" she asked. I thought about it for a long moment, remembering every meeting where our proposals were dismissed before we finished speaking, every request for basic respect that was answered with polite condescension, every quiet favor Earth had done for the Council that was never once acknowledged. "No," I said. "I think they'll wait for us to fail on our own, and when we don't, that's when they'll really be shocked." Below us, through the small viewport, Earth hung in the black distance, blue and steady, and unaware that its ambassadors were bringing home the end of an old world and the beginning of something the galaxy had never seen before. None of us spoke again until the shuttle broke atmosphere and the lights of home came rushing up to meet us. For the first time in years, I felt something unfamiliar settle into my chest. Not fear, not doubt, relief. We had spent a decade trying to be heard in a room that never intended to listen. Now, at last, the room would have to listen to our absence instead. I did not know then how loud silence could be. I did not know how many worlds depended on the quiet things humanity did without asking for credit, without asking for thanks, and without ever being invited to sit at the head of the table. I only knew that as the shuttle doors sealed shut behind us, something had changed forever, and there was no going back to the way things were. Grace looked at me one more time before we landed. "Well," she said, almost smiling despite everything, "I suppose we should tell the president it's done." I nodded, and for the first time since walking out of that chamber, I allowed myself a small, tired smile of my own. "Yes," I said, "it's done." But it was not over. Not even close. What we had just started would ripple outward across the stars, faster and further than any of us could have imagined, and the galaxy that had spent so long underestimating humanity was about to learn exactly what it had lost the moment it stopped taking us seriously. The first sign that something had truly changed came 4 days after we left the council station, and it did not arrive with alarms or warnings. It arrived with silence. A supply convoy from the Threll Alliance, carrying medical equipment bound for a mining colony near the edge of Council space, failed to reach its destination on schedule. This convoy had used a human-built navigation relay for the past 6 years, a quiet piece of infrastructure that human engineers maintained without fanfare, without payment beyond a small maintenance fee, and without ever receiving public credit. The relay had simply stopped responding. Nobody had shut it down out of anger. We had simply stopped staffing it, the way you would stop mowing a neighbor's lawn once you were no longer friends. I learned about this from Grace, who had a contact still working inside the council's logistics division, an old friend named Priya Anand, who had once studied alongside her at university before joining the council's civil service. Priya reached out through an unofficial channel, her voice tight with confusion rather than anger. "Ethan," Grace said, holding the comm device toward me so I could hear, "she says 3 convoys are stuck. Nobody can figure out why the relay isn't working. Tell her the truth, I said. Tell her nobody's flying it anymore. There was a long pause on the other end. Then Priya's voice came through, quieter now. You mean humans were the ones running that entire relay system this whole time? For 6 years, Grace said, along with 4 others near the outer trade lanes. Another pause. The council doesn't even list human maintenance crews on the official infrastructure charts, Priya said. I didn't know. That was the moment I began to understand the true shape of what we had done. It was not simply that we had walked out of a chamber. It was that we had quietly, invisibly, been holding up more of the galaxy than anyone outside our own people had ever realized, and nobody had bothered to ask who was keeping the lights on. Over the following 2 weeks, the disruptions grew louder, even though we ourselves stayed almost completely silent. Earth issued no threats. We made no demands. We simply stopped, and the ripples spread outward like a stone dropped into still water. A Drayan research station near the frontier lost access to a communication network built on human relay satellites, cutting off 300 scientists from contact with their homeworld for 11 days. A trade route connecting 2 rival species kept peaceful for years by human mediators who had quietly stepped in whenever tensions flared, saw its first violent skirmish in nearly a decade. A medical shipment of a treatment developed by human researchers, a treatment for a wasting illness affecting children on a distant colony, sat undelivered in a warehouse because the delivery had always been handled, free of charge, by a small team of human volunteers who no longer had clearance to travel through council space. I remember reading the reports each night in the makeshift office Grace and I shared in the capital, watching the numbers climb, feeling a strange, uncomfortable mixture of vindication and unease. They built their whole system assuming we'd always show up, Grace said one evening, rubbing her eyes after another long day of monitoring incoming data, assuming we'd always fix things quietly and never ask for anything in return. We did ask, I said, for years. Every time, they nodded politely and changed the subject. She didn't argue with that. She couldn't, because it was true, and we both knew it. What surprised me most was not the scale of the disruption, but how long it took for the council to admit there was even a problem. Vorn Kesh, in a public address to council members 8 days after our withdrawal, dismissed the early reports as temporary inefficiencies unrelated to any single species' absence. He mentioned humanity only once, in passing, referring to our exit as a symbolic gesture with no material consequence. I watched that broadcast from our small monitoring room on Earth, arms crossed, unable to decide whether to feel angry or simply tired. He still doesn't get it, Grace said. He will, I said. Give it time. Time, it turned out, was the one thing we had plenty of, and the council did not. 3 weeks into our withdrawal, an unexpected visitor arrived at the edge of our solar system. A single, unarmed shuttle, broadcasting an old diplomatic frequency, requested permission to approach Earth. It carried a small crew of 6 beings from 4 different species, none of them official council representatives. When we finally allowed them to land under strict observation, their leader introduced herself as Sela Marin, a logistics coordinator from a mid-sized trade alliance that had quietly relied on human transport routes for over a decade. She did not come with demands, she came with questions. "We are not here on behalf of the council," she said, sitting across from Grace and me in a small conference room, her voice careful, almost apologetic. "We are here because our supply lines are collapsing, and nobody in our government understands why, because nobody realized how much of it depended on your people." I studied her for a long moment before answering. "What do you want us to say?" "The truth," she said. "Why did you really leave?" I thought about my answer carefully, because I understood this was the first real chance for someone outside our own species to hear it plainly, without a council chamber full of distractions and dismissals. "For years," I said, "humanity solved problems no one else wanted to touch. We built relay systems nobody else wanted to maintain. We flew supply routes through dangerous space because our ships were fast and our pilots were willing. We mediated conflicts between species who refused to speak to each other directly, and we did it quietly, without asking for recognition, because we believed that was what good neighbors did. Selah listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable but attentive. And in return, I continued, we were called simple, primitive, a young species that should be grateful for a seat at a table we were rarely allowed to speak at. Every proposal we brought was delayed, diluted, or dismissed. Every request for basic fairness was treated as an inconvenience. We were useful, Selah. We were never respected, and eventually a species can only be useful for so long before it decides usefulness without respect isn't a partnership at all. She was quiet for a long moment. That's not something the council will want to hear. No, I agreed, but it's something they need to hear. Selah returned to her people 3 days later, carrying with her not a treaty, but a message, one that would eventually make its way into private conversations across dozens of worlds that had never before questioned the quiet cost of human generosity. Meanwhile, back on the council station, the pressure was mounting in ways Vornkesh could no longer dismiss as symbolic. A formal report was leaked, not by us, but by a junior council administrator frustrated with the growing chaos, revealing the staggering number of essential functions humanity had quietly performed across council territory for years, all without formal recognition or fair compensation: relay maintenance, emergency medical transport, conflict mediation between hostile species, search and rescue operations in dangerous, unclaimed space that other fleets refused to enter. The report spread quickly among lower-ranking officials, sparking private outrage that the council's leadership had never bothered to properly value or even fully acknowledge the scale of what humanity contributed. I remember the night Grace showed me the leaked document on her tablet, her expression somewhere between disbelief and grim satisfaction. "They didn't even know," she said. "Half of the council never knew how much we were doing, because it was never written down as ours. It was just assumed to be part of the background of the galaxy, like gravity. And now gravity's gone," I said quietly. Neither of us laughed, because it wasn't really funny, it was simply true. By the end of the first month, 3 smaller species had quietly reached out to Earth through unofficial channels, each asking the same careful question Selah had asked. "Why did you leave, and what would it take for you to consider helping again?" We gave every one of them the same honest answer: not yet. Not until the terms of any future relationship reflected actual respect, not convenience. Grace and I spent long nights compiling every message, every request, every quiet admission of dependency, building a clearer picture of just how deeply humanity had been woven into the fabric of galactic life without ever being properly seen. It was strange, cataloging our own quiet importance, feeling both proud and sorrowful that it had taken our absence for anyone to notice it at all. One evening, as the 4th week of our withdrawal came to a close, I stood on the balcony of our office building, looking up at a clear night sky filled with stars I could no longer see as simply beautiful. Each one represented a world that had, in some way, leaned on humanity without ever truly seeing us as equals. Grace joined me quietly, holding 2 cups of tea, handing me one without a word. "Do you think this changes anything permanently?" she asked. "Or do you think they'll patch things up just enough to go back to how it was?" I considered the question for a long moment, watching the stars blink steadily above us, indifferent to the quiet upheaval unfolding beneath them. "I think," I said slowly, "the galaxy just found out what it feels like to lose something it never bothered to appreciate, and I think, for the first time, we finally have the power to decide what happens next, instead of simply reacting to what's handed to us." Grace nodded, sipping her tea, her eyes distant with thought. Neither of us knew yet just how far this would go, or how much more the galaxy would have to lose before the Council was finally forced to face humanity, not as a convenient tool to be used, but as an equal they could no longer afford to ignore. That reckoning was closer than either of us realized, and it would arrive not through more silence, but through a single, unexpected knock on humanity's door. The knock, when it finally came, was not subtle. It arrived in the form of a single Council cruiser entering Earth's outer system without prior clearance, its markings unmistakable, its intentions unclear. For the first time since our withdrawal, I felt something close to real alarm. I was in the command center within minutes, standing beside General Marcus Doyle, the officer overseeing Earth's defense grid, watching the unidentified ship slow its approach and broadcast an old diplomatic signal, the kind used only for emergency negotiation requests. "They're not armed for confrontation," Doyle said, studying the readouts. "Sensors show minimal weapons systems. This isn't a show of force." "Then what is it?" Grace asked, arriving just behind me, her hair still damp from being pulled away from an early morning briefing. The answer came moments later, when the ship transmitted a formal request, not a demand, not a threat, a request, addressed directly to me, from a name I did not expect, Vorn Kesh. "He wants to speak with you personally," Doyle said, reading the message aloud. "Unescorted, just you, and whoever you choose to bring." I looked at Grace. She raised an eyebrow, waiting for my decision. "Let him land," I said. "But under our terms, not his." 3 hours later, I stood in a private meeting room on Earth, the first Council official to ever set foot on our planet since our withdrawal. Vorn Kesh looked different than he had in the chamber. Smaller, somehow, despite standing at his full height. His 4 eyes carried none of the amused confidence I remembered from that final Council session. "Ambassador Hale," he said, his translator carrying a careful, measured tone. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." "I'm curious," I said, gesturing for him to sit across the table from me, Grace taking a seat at my side. "Last I recall, you called our withdrawal theater, a symbolic gesture with no material consequence." His eyes lowered slightly, an alien gesture I had come to recognize, over years of diplomacy, as something close to embarrassment. "I was wrong," he said simply. "The Council was wrong. I am here because the consequences of your absence have become impossible to ignore, and because certain individuals within the Council leadership have finally acknowledged what should have been obvious years ago." "And what's that?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "That humanity was never simply a member species among many," he said, "that you were, in practice, one of the primary pillars holding significant portions of our infrastructure and diplomacy together, and that this contribution was systematically undervalued, both in official records and in the respect it warranted." I let the silence stretch for a long moment before responding. Grace remained quiet beside me, watching Vorn Kesh carefully, her expression giving nothing away. "Do you know what changed for us in that chamber?" I asked. "The moment you announced you were taking a colony from 11,000 human civilians as if it were a simple accounting adjustment. I have been informed of the significance," he said. "Have you been informed of the pattern?" I asked. "Every proposal we brought delayed. Every concern dismissed. Every quiet favor humanity performed treated as an expected, unpaid obligation, while our own needs were treated as an inconvenience to be managed, not addressed." Vorn Kesh was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its earlier formality. "I did not fully understand the scale of your contributions until the reports began circulating among Council administrators. I did not know your engineers maintained our relay systems. I did not know your pilots flew rescue missions through space our own fleets refused to enter. I did not know your mediators had quietly prevented at least 3 armed conflicts between rival species over the past decade." "None of that was hidden," Grace said quietly. "You simply never asked." He nodded slowly, an admission that seemed to cost him something. That is the truth I have come here to correct. The Council wishes to formally apologize and to open new negotiations, ones that would recognize humanity not as a resource to be utilized, but as a full and equal partner, with representation and protections equal to any founding species of the Council. I studied him carefully, searching for any trace of the same dismissive confidence he had shown weeks earlier. I found none. What I found instead was something closer to genuine concern, the kind that comes only when consequences have become too large to explain away. "That's a significant shift," I said carefully. "It is a necessary one," he replied. 3 species have already reached out to Earth independently, seeking to establish direct relationships outside Council oversight. If the Council does not act to properly repair this relationship, we risk losing not only your cooperation, but potentially your alliance altogether, to agreements formed entirely outside our authority. I glanced at Grace. We had, of course, already known about those approaches. We had simply been waiting to see whether the Council itself would ever come to the same realization on its own, without being pushed by fear of losing relevance entirely. "I appreciate your honesty," I said finally, "but an apology alone doesn't rebuild 11 years of dismissal. Before we consider any new negotiations, there are conditions that must be met, not as requests, but as requirements." Vorn Kesh straightened slightly. "I am prepared to hear them." I laid out our first condition clearly. Full transparency. Every contribution humanity has made to Council infrastructure, mediation, and defense over the past decade must be formally documented and publicly acknowledged, not buried in internal reports only administrators happen to read. He nodded. "Reasonable." "Second," I continued, "the colony near Vela remains under human governance, permanently, with full recognition of our historical claim, and no future attempt to reassign it without our direct consent. I will bring this before the full Council," he said. "Third," Grace added, her voice steady, "any future Council decision affecting human territory or human citizens requires a 2/3 majority vote, not a simple majority, ensuring no single alliance of species can outvote our interests on issues directly affecting us." Vorn Kesh was quiet for a long moment, clearly calculating the political difficulty of securing such a change. "This will not be easy to pass," he admitted. "Neither was watching our people's concerns dismissed for a decade," I said. "We're not asking for special treatment. We're asking for basic fairness, the same fairness every founding species already enjoys." He nodded slowly, accepting the weight of the request. "And the final condition?" I paused, considering how to phrase the last and most important point. "We will not be returning to the Council chamber as it currently exists," I said. "Instead, humanity will establish its own independent council, open to any species willing to engage with us as true equals, under terms of mutual respect and mutual benefit. Any future relationship between Earth and the Galactic Council will exist alongside this new structure, not beneath it." For the first time since he arrived, Vorn Kesh looked genuinely surprised. "You intend to build a rival institution?" "Not a rival," I said. "An alternative. One where species are judged by their willingness to engage honestly, not by the age of their civilization or the size of their fleets." He considered this carefully, his 4 eyes studying me with something that looked almost like respect, an expression I had never once seen from him during our years inside the Council chamber. "I will need to consult with the full Council leadership before providing any formal response," he said finally, "but I will personally recommend that these conditions be given serious consideration." "That's all we ask," I said. Serious consideration, something we were rarely given ourselves. He rose to leave, pausing at the door, turning back toward me with an expression I could not fully read. "For what it's worth, Ambassador Hale, I underestimated your species significantly. I do not intend to make that mistake again." "See that you don't," I said quietly, "because the next time humanity walks away from a table, we won't be walking back." He nodded once, a gesture of genuine acknowledgement, before departing. Grace and I remained in the room long after his shuttle had lifted off, both of us processing the sudden shift in tone from dismissal to desperate negotiation. "Do you think they'll actually agree to all of it?" Grace asked. "Some of it," I said. "Enough to start. The rest, we'll have to earn through consistency, not promises." Over the following days, word of Vornkesh's visit spread quickly across both human and council channels, sparking intense debate among council member species about the true cost of humanity's absence and the uncomfortable truth that our departure had exposed. Species that had never once considered humanity an equal now found themselves publicly reckoning with just how much quiet strength our presence had provided, and how carelessly that strength had been taken for granted. For the first time in over a decade, Earth was no longer negotiating from a position of quiet desperation, hoping to be heard. We were negotiating from a position of undeniable necessity, having proven, through nothing more than our own calculated silence, that respect could not be assumed. It had to be earned, and it had to be protected, even if that meant walking away from the very table that once dismissed us as too simple to matter. I stood at my office window that evening, watching Earth's sun set behind the distant hills, feeling for the first time in years a version of hope that felt solid rather than desperate. We had not asked for war. We had not asked for revenge. We had simply asked to be seen clearly, for exactly what we had always been. And at long last, the galaxy was finally beginning to look. Not every consequence of our withdrawal brought satisfaction, and it would have been dishonest to pretend otherwise. In the weeks following Vornkesh's visit, while formal negotiations slowly began to take shape, reports continued to arrive describing the wider cost of humanity's absence, and some of them were difficult to read without feeling the weight of it settle deep in my chest. A small colony on the edge of Drayan territory, one we had quietly supplied with medical shipments for years through an informal arrangement, reported a sharp rise in a treatable illness after their usual delivery routes collapsed. Grace brought me the report late one evening, her expression carefully neutral, though I could see the effort it took her to keep it that way. 42 cases, she said quietly. Children mostly. Nothing that couldn't have been prevented if the shipment had gone through on schedule. I read the report twice, feeling the uncomfortable pull between two truths that did not fit easily together. We had done nothing wrong by refusing to continue an arrangement that had never once been formally recognized or fairly compensated. And yet, somewhere out there, children were suffering because a supply chain built entirely on human generosity had quietly disappeared the moment we stopped being willing to work for free. "We didn't cause this," I said, more to convince myself than to argue with Grace. "The Council did, by never building a real system that didn't depend entirely on us." "I know," she said, "but knowing that doesn't make it easier to read." We sat with that discomfort for a long while, neither of us speaking, both of us understanding that the path we had chosen, however necessary, was not without a cost that fell on people who had nothing to do with the decisions that led to it. Elsewhere, the consequences took a different shape. A long-standing agreement between two rival trading species, the Callan and the Ostari, had been maintained for years through the quiet mediation of a small team of human negotiators, people who understood both cultures well enough to smooth over disputes before they escalated into anything serious. Without that mediation, an old territorial disagreement flared again, resulting in a brief but tense standoff near a shared mining outpost. No lives were lost, thankfully, but several ships were damaged, and decades of careful diplomatic balance nearly unraveled in a matter of days. I remember watching the news coverage of the standoff from our office, feeling a strange mixture of vindication and unease as commentators from both species openly acknowledged, for the first time, how much they had relied on human mediators without ever properly valuing their presence. "It's strange," Grace said, watching the same broadcast beside me. "They're finally saying our names out loud, crediting us publicly, and it's happening because things are falling apart, not because things are going well. That's usually how it works, I said. People rarely notice the quiet things holding everything together until those things are gone. The most difficult moment came nearly 6 weeks into our withdrawal, when a distress signal reached Earth from a struggling exploration vessel belonging to a smaller, independent species called the Fenari, a peaceful people we had worked alongside for years on scientific expeditions near the edges of known space. Their ship had suffered a critical malfunction far from any Council rescue routes, in a region so dangerous that only human pilots had ever been willing to fly missions there, due to our advanced hull technology and our crew's unusual comfort with high-risk environments. The message reached Grace directly, through an old contact she had maintained with a Fenari scientist named Toril Anson, someone she had worked alongside years earlier during a joint research mission. Grace brought the message straight to me, her hands trembling slightly as she read it aloud. 12 crew members stranded, oxygen reserves failing, no rescue capable of reaching them in time except a human vessel. I remember the exact moment the decision settled in my chest, clear and immediate, cutting through every ounce of political caution I had carried since our withdrawal began. "We're not the Council anymore," I said, "but we're still human. Get me General Doyle." Within the hour, a rescue crew was assembled, led by a pilot named Daniel Marsh, one of the most experienced deep space rescue specialists Earth had ever produced. I stood in the command center as the mission launched, watching the trajectory display show our ship cutting through dangerous, uncharted space at speeds few other species would have dared attempt. The hours that followed were some of the longest of my life. Grace and I remained in the command center long after most others had gone to rest, watching updates arrive in short, tense bursts. Hull integrity failing on the Fenari vessel. Oxygen reserves at 11%. Human rescue ship encountering unexpected debris field, forced to alter course. At the 23-hour mark, a final update arrived, and I felt my chest tighten as I read it. Rescue successful. All 12 crew members recovered. No human casualties. Grace let out a breath she had clearly been holding for hours, pressing a hand to her mouth, her eyes bright with relief. I allowed myself a rare, quiet moment of emotion, feeling the tension of the past day finally begin to release. "We didn't do that for the Council," I said quietly. "We did that because it was right." "I know," Grace said, "but it matters that we still could. It matters that walking away from them didn't mean walking away from who we are." News of the rescue spread quickly, not through official channels, but through the grateful, unfiltered testimony of the Fenari crew themselves, who spoke openly and repeatedly about the bravery of human pilots who came for them when no one else was willing or able to try. Toril Anson, the scientist Grace had once worked alongside, gave a public statement that spread rapidly across multiple networks, describing humanity not as simple or primitive, but as, in her words, quietly, fiercely loyal to anyone willing to see us as more than a convenient tool. That single rescue did more to shift public opinion across dozens of worlds than any formal negotiation could have accomplished. It reminded everyone watching that humanity's withdrawal was never about cruelty or indifference. It was about refusing to be taken for granted, while still remaining exactly who we had always been underneath all of it, willing to help, willing to risk everything for people in need, so long as that willingness was finally met with genuine respect, rather than quiet exploitation. In the days that followed, I received an unexpected personal message from Toril Anson herself, thanking me directly and asking a question that stayed with me long after I read it. "Why did your people risk so much for us when we have nothing to offer in return?" I thought carefully about my answer before sending it back to her, because that's the difference between what we walked away from and who we actually are. We left a table that only valued us for what we could provide. We will always show up for people who simply need help, because that choice was never about payment. It was about decency, something the Council forgot to ask us for, and something we never stopped offering freely to those who actually needed it. Her response came quickly, simple and heartfelt. Then perhaps the galaxy has been asking humanity the wrong questions all along. I read that message several times that evening, feeling something settle inside me that had been unsettled since the moment we first walked out of that council chamber. We had proven, through both our absence and our continued willingness to help where help was truly needed, that our departure was never about anger or vengeance. It was about drawing a clear, unshakable line between being used and being valued, and refusing to accept anything less than the second option ever again. As negotiations with the Council continued to develop in the background, quiet and careful, this single rescue mission became something far more important than any formal treaty could ever be. It became proof, undeniable and freely witnessed by dozens of watching worlds, that humanity's strength had never come from military power or advanced technology alone. It came from a simple, stubborn refusal to abandon decency, even after being repeatedly denied basic respect in return. Grace and I stood together on that same office balcony that evening, watching the stars appear one by one against the darkening sky, feeling the weight of the past weeks settle into something that finally resembled solid ground beneath our feet. "We're not the same people who walked out of that chamber," Grace said quietly. "No," I agreed. "We're the people the galaxy is only just beginning to understand." Above us, somewhere among those countless distant stars, word of humanity's quiet strength continued spreading from world to world, carried not through council declarations, but through the simple, powerful testimony of people we had helped, expecting nothing in return, exactly as we always had, and exactly as we always would. The final chapter of this story, the one that would determine what kind of galaxy would rise from the wreckage of an old, broken system, was only just beginning to take shape. The formal invitation arrived on a quiet morning, nearly 10 weeks after we first walked out of the council chamber, delivered not by Vornkesh alone, but by a delegation representing the full leadership of the Galactic Council itself. Grace read the message aloud to me over breakfast, her voice steady despite the significance of what she was reading. The Galactic Council formally and unconditionally apologizes to the human race for years of systemic disregard, dismissal, and unequal treatment. We acknowledge the extensive, often uncredited contributions of humanity to Council stability, infrastructure, and diplomacy. We respectfully request the return of human representation to the Council, under any terms Earth deems necessary, to ensure a truly equal partnership moving forward. I set my cup down slowly, staring at the words for a long moment before speaking. 10 weeks, I said. 10 weeks to say what should have been obvious for the past decade. "Better late than never," Grace said, though her tone carried the same weary caution I felt myself. We spent the following days in careful deliberation, consulting not only with Earth's leadership, but with representatives from the smaller species who had reached out to us independently during our withdrawal. Species like Selamarin's Trade Alliance and Toril Anson's Fenari scientists, all of whom had expressed genuine interest in building something new alongside humanity, rather than simply returning to an old, broken system. It was Grace who first suggested the shape our answer should take. "What if we don't choose between rebuilding the old table or refusing to engage at all?" she said, during a long evening planning session in our office. "What if we build our own table instead? One built from the very beginning on equal footing, and invite anyone willing to sit there honestly." I considered her idea carefully, feeling the shape of something significant beginning to form. "A new council," I said slowly. "Not a replacement for the old one, an alternative, open to any species willing to meet us as true equals." "Exactly," she said. "Let the old council keep its structure, its history, its habits. We build something new, based entirely on mutual respect, from the ground up." Over the following month, we worked carefully alongside a growing coalition of smaller species, each of whom had come to understand, through humanity's absence, the true cost of a system built on convenience rather than fairness. Sela Marin's trade alliance joined first, followed shortly by 3 additional species who had grown weary of the older council's slow, unequal processes. Even Toril Anson's people, the Fenari, expressed cautious interest, largely because of the rescue mission that had proven humanity's character so clearly during a moment that demanded nothing in return. Vorn Kesh himself requested a final meeting before the formal announcement of our new coalition, arriving once again on Earth, though this time with noticeably less confidence than either of his previous visits. "I understand you intend to establish an independent council," he said, sitting across from me in the same small meeting room where we had spoken months earlier. "We do," I confirmed, "open to any species willing to engage honestly, regardless of age, size, or historical standing." "And the Galactic Council?" he asked. "What becomes of our relationship if this new coalition moves forward?" I considered my answer carefully before responding. "The Council will remain exactly what it has always been, a large, established structure with its own value and its own history. But it will no longer be the only path available to species seeking fair representation. Earth will maintain formal diplomatic relations with the Council, based on the conditions Grace and I outlined during your last visit. But our true energy, moving forward, will go toward building something better, alongside those willing to build it with us." Vorn Kesh absorbed this quietly, his 4 eyes lowering slightly in what I now recognized clearly as genuine reflection. "You could have simply demanded reform within our existing structure," he said. "Why choose instead to build something entirely separate?" "Because reform within a broken system rarely lasts," I said. "Old habits return, old hierarchies reassert themselves. We didn't want to fix what was broken. We wanted to build something incapable of breaking the same way again." He nodded slowly, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw something that looked genuinely like respect in his expression, rather than simple political calculation. "I will inform the Council of your decision," he said, "and for what it's worth, Ambassador Hale, I believe history will remember this moment as the point where the galaxy finally began treating humanity as it always should have." "Then, perhaps," I said quietly, "something good came from all of this after all." The formal announcement of the new coalition, eventually named the Unified Assembly by its founding members, took place 3 months after our initial withdrawal from the old council chamber. I stood before representatives from 6 different species, including a small human delegation, Sela Marin's Trade Alliance, Toril Anson's Fenari scientists, and 3 additional species who had each experienced, in their own way, the quiet cost of a galaxy built on convenience rather than fairness. I remember standing at the podium that day, looking out over a room filled with beings from across known space, each of them choosing, freely and without coercion, to build something new rather than cling to an old system that had failed too many of them for too long. "For years," I said, beginning my address carefully, "humanity was told we had a place in the galaxy, so long as we remained useful, and remained quiet about the cost of that usefulness. We were asked to give without expecting fairness in return, and for a long time we accepted that arrangement, because we believed showing up, again and again, would eventually earn the respect we deserved." I paused, letting the silence settle over the room before continuing. It didn't. Not until we finally stopped showing up altogether, and the galaxy was forced to notice exactly what our quiet, consistent presence had been holding together all along. I looked out over the gathered representatives, each of them listening intently, each of them here by choice, rather than obligation. "This assembly will not be built on convenience," I said. "It will be built on the simple, unshakable principle that every species deserves a genuine voice, regardless of size, age, or military strength. We are not here to replace what came before. We are here to prove that something better was always possible, if only someone was willing to build it honestly. The room erupted into a steady, sincere applause, unlike the polite, distracted reception humanity had so often received within the old council chamber. This applause felt different. It felt earned, rather than simply expected. After the ceremony, Grace found me standing quietly near the edge of the gathering, watching representatives from 6 different species mingle freely, exchanging ideas, and building genuine connections, rather than simply performing diplomatic obligations. "We did it," she said quietly, standing beside me. "No," I said, watching the room continue to fill with quiet, genuine conversation. "We started it. The rest depends on whether we can maintain what we've built, long after the excitement of this moment fades." Grace smiled, a rare, genuine expression after months of exhausting, careful work. "I think we can," she said. "I think we finally proved something important, not just to them, but to ourselves." "What's that?" I asked. "That respect isn't something you beg for," she said. "It's something you build, carefully, deliberately, with people willing to build it alongside you. And once you have it, real respect, earned honestly, it's worth infinitely more than any seat at any old, unequal table ever could be." I thought about her words for a long moment, watching the room continue to grow warmer with genuine connection rather than careful political distance. 6 months earlier, we had walked out of a chamber that never truly valued us, uncertain of what would follow, uncertain whether our decision would strengthen or shatter humanity's place among the stars. We had faced real consequences for that choice, difficult moments where our absence caused genuine harm to people who deserved better, moments that reminded us clearly that power, even quiet power, carries real responsibility. But we had also proven something the galaxy desperately needed to understand. That true strength was never measured by how much a species was willing to quietly endure, but by how clearly it understood its own worth and how firmly it was willing to protect that worth, even when doing so meant walking away from everything familiar. As the evening wound down and representatives from 6 different species continued building the early foundation of something genuinely new, I found myself standing once again on a balcony, watching the stars appear steadily overhead, feeling, for the first time in longer than I could remember, a version of peace that felt solid rather than desperate. Earth was no longer a quiet, convenient tool within someone else's larger system. We had become, through nothing more than a single, quiet decision to finally value ourselves, the foundation of something new entirely, built not on old hierarchies or historical claims, but on the simple, powerful understanding that real partnership requires real respect, freely given and freely earned. The galaxy, it turned out, had never truly known what it had in humanity, not because we hid our strength, but because our strength had always looked, to those unwilling to look closely, like simple kindness. They understood now. And for the first time in a very long while, so did we.